Yes, good morning. So good to see you here. My name is Pamela Gifford, and I have the honor of introducing Lillian to you today. I've known Lillian for professionally and personally for almost 30 years, hard to believe, having served as a reader and an editor for many of her wonderful books. And I actually first met Lillian when I was a reporter at the Downers Grove Reporter newspaper, which many of you remember, to cover the publishing of her first book, The Gate of Dreams, in 1993. And it should tell you something that I scheduled 30 minutes for the interview, and I left about 3 or 4 hours later, unaware of the time that had passed. And it says a lot about the kind of person Lillian is. I think it's this unique combination of care, empathy, humor, and insight that makes an afternoon with Lillian pass in a blink. And it's also that thread that comes through in her work. And I think it's because she listens to people and to the world so well, she creates the deepest kind of art. I always found that it was the smallest, most personal detail or some kind of remembrance in one of her own writings that cut to the core of my own experience and that made me see something new in myself or in the world. I loved how one book reviewer described her style. And I quote, "Moats handles every word with exquisite care and respect, as though each is a precious stone, a seed, a candle flame." And this compels people to lean in and listen to Lillian, as I think so many of you have done reading her works. Lillian was born in Detroit and spent her childhood years at the prestigious Cranbrook schools. She attended Barnard College and graduated with a BFA in art and creative writing from the University of Michigan and an MS in education from the University of Wisconsin. She's been an artist throughout her life, creating in mediums including painting, film, illustration, and literature. With her creative partner, J.P. Somersalter, she's created more than 20 animated short films from original stories and retellings of classic folk and fairy tales. These films have won 41 film festival awards at screenings that have been held all over the world, with 5 of their films awarded Cine Gold Eagle Awards and selected to officially represent the United States at foreign film festivals. And these films are now in the permanent collection of the Chicago Film Archive. Lillian will be speaking about her books now, but I wanted to note that some of the best-known authors, historians, and intellectuals such as Bruno Bettelheim and Robert Coles have endorsed her work. And Howard Zinn wrote the foreword to her 2009 book, Letter from Death. After I joined the International Justice Mission in 2006, I learned about the plight of human trafficking victims. And Lillian, already very active in the peace and justice movement, really inspired me by how deeply she cares for our people and our planet. A devoted and unflinching proponent of these causes for years, Lillian was awarded the American Friends Service Committee's Speaking Truth to Power Award for her artwork promoting peace and social justice in 2011. So please let's lean in and listen and give a warm welcome to Lillian Moats.
Oh, thank you, Pamela. It was way more than I deserve. Isn't it wonderful how sometimes you meet someone and you just know almost immediately that they're going to be in your life permanently? Thank you. So welcome, everyone. It's so good to have you here with me to celebrate the birth of my 6th book. Anderson's Bookshops are a regional treasure, and this store in particular has befriended my writing since 1993. No indie author is really independent. I've leaned heavily on my family, Michael and Dave, on creative partner, J.P. Somersalter, and dear friends and colleagues. Without them, all of my writing would have remained in my file cabinet. As many of you know, and particularly after Ginny's words, the pub date for If You Exist was August 23rd, my 75th birthday. but COVID-19 had something to say about when I could celebrate live at Anderson's. Some of you have been following my writing since 1993. For those who are new to it, there are copies of each of my 6 books at the front of the store to browse through and or purchase if you'd like. This is apple cider vinegar and honey. So if I make a face every time I take a sip of this. The last time I had a book launch at Anderson's in 2015, I spoke about the very personal through line that connected each of my books to the next. This afternoon, besides introducing my newest book, I'll be emphasizing what makes each book distinctly different from all of the others. I'm calling this talk, Where Should I Be Standing? I'll tell you the anecdote behind that title. When our son Dave was 7 years old, he was tested for learning disabilities by Mary Ellen Gavin, who knows a great deal about learning difficulties among gifted people as well as all people. His frustrations with reading and writing at school made him eager for this day. At the end of the testing, Mary Ellen asked Dave to draw a picture of his house. She already knew he was bright and artistic, so when he stared, perplexed, at the blank paper, she asked him if something was troubling him. He said, "Yes, where do you want me to be standing? In front of my house? At the side? Behind it? Do you want me to draw my house from above?" These fondly remembered words of his give me the metaphor for this talk. I could also have called it vantage points. By the way, when Mary Ellen gave the results of her testing to our family, it was a red letter day for Dave, and unexpectedly for me as well. Her written report of Dave's strengths and the likely hurdles ahead of him captured my undiagnosed dyslexia as well as his. He felt so relieved to know what was going on and that she could help him. I felt dramatically awakened. Finally, the answer to so many mysteries about my life presented itself. This won't be a talk about learning differences, except to make the point that, as with so many other handicaps, compensating strengths often present themselves. Compensating strengths, and I will emphasize novel perspectives. Some of you know Dave, but probably don't know he's 38 now, has his doctorate in sociology. Do you mind giving us a little wave, Dave? He lives in London with his wonderful and multi-talented girlfriend, Jen, while he's employed by Helsinki University in Finland, teaching remotely and doing research on algorithms and social media. Now, to the varied vantage points I've adopted in my writing. Each book began with an unspoken question to myself, which amounted to, where should I be standing to tell this story? For me, the vantage point often arrives inseparably from the subject. I'll spend a little time on my previous books, ending with the new one, If You Exist. I won't spend much time on my first book, The Gate of Dreams, which is a collection of fairy tales I wrote and illustrated. Many of you know it quite well, and I want to save time at the end for If You Exist. But this is what the 2 editions of The Gate of Dreams look like. I'd like to show you, however, a couple of illustrations that are representative of the others in the Gate of Dreams. This one is one of the 6 color plates that appeared in the first edition. And this is typical of the silhouette illustrations that run through the entire book in both editions. And we have Mim Eichmann here with us, who is a choreographer and retired director of the Midwest Ballet Theater. Her dancers modeled for the silhouettes, not just of dancers, but of almost all the characters in that book. The voice that I assumed to write The Gate of Dreams was very traditional, that of an omniscient author. To relate that to Dave's questions, writing as an omniscient author is a bit like drawing your house while floating above it. Unbeknownst to most readers, and for a long time, unbeknownst to me, was the extent to which these 3 fairy tales were symbolic translations from my own personal history. Posing as an omniscient entity who had great distance on these stories gave me the space, anonymity, and perspective I needed to transform them and make them universal. In 1999, Legacy of Shadows was released. Decades before that, I had been diagnosed with a prolonged emotional fragmentation, which spanned 5 years, from my late 20s through early 30s. Where should I stand to tell the story of emotional despair that had been passed from one generation to another in my family, culminating in the mysterious symptoms of mine? After living with the question for years, the answer came to me seemingly out of nowhere. On a Christmas Eve, I felt a sudden inspiration to write in prose poetry an imagined journal entry by my grandmother. That became the opening of Legacy of Shadows, a collection of fictionalized journal entries by my grandmother, mother, and myself. The background you need for the passage I'll read is that after losing her 2.5-year-old daughter to whooping cough, my 40-year-old grandmother died in the influenza pandemic of 1919. We've all heard a lot about that scourge in the age of COVID-19. I'll read the first diary entry by my mother, who at 14 was left with enormous responsibility for her younger siblings. Toronto, March 1919. They wouldn't let me visit you alone. At first, it was the germs that kept us out. Then it was your frailty. Finally, when they filed, the children passed. We weren't allowed to speak, but only listen. So faintly that I had to read your lips, you whispered, "Lisbeth, you'll have to be the little mother now." That's all. Today, the twins pulled Jack from his box. His mechanisms jammed, his handles lost, and I'm thinking that I know what it is like to be a jack-in-the-box. You huddle in the dark, unseen and not heard, until you catch the music racing at someone else's pace. Then pop, you're on stage. I never minded, Mother. as long as I could feel your hand upon the crank. Tonight, I'm huddled in the dark with all my questions. I'll never know how fast or slow you'd have me go, or when to hide, or when to show. Today, they buried you inside a box, inside the ground, with all the answers. That's something like laughing at your own jokes. After my own mother died in 1996, my grief for her was expressed in unanticipated ways during long months of daily meditation. I should preface talking about Speak Hands by telling you that, as part of my unusual mental wiring, my differences, my hands have always played an exceptionally prominent and unusual role. I have often joked that I think my brains must be in my fingertips, for I often can't imagine what's in my mind's eye, the image I'm about to create, until it's directly expressed through my hands in typing or drawing. During meditation after my mother's death, I would fall into a light meditative trance. It was not long before my hands began to levitate. For weeks, they did nothing more than to lift weightlessly and hold still at shoulder height. Eventually, I lost my fear of what would happen next. Though many early memories had returned to me in therapy, they now reveal themselves much more deeply through gesture. In my childhood, there were 3 consecutive winters when my mother suffered from pneumonia. I was 2, 3, and 4 years old. Too often, I needed to be left alone with my mother. I kept a kind of vigil on the floor beside her couch. What I began to experience in meditation when I was 50 was a return to a language which I had relied upon as a small child, when my mastery of words was very limited. Children drift into trances much more easily than do adults. In these childhood trances, I could express my feelings without words, without waking my mother, through gesture alone. Where could I stand to convey the startling, enlightening, and silent retrospective that had been buried for most of my life? And where could I stand to convey the solidly grounded psychology behind the experience? Eventually, I used 4 perspectives, all aspects of myself, and all working together to convey to my reader my growing understanding of my early childhood. The first voice was the same as the one I'm using to speak to you now. There were 2 voices translating the gestures of my hands, and a 4th perspective voiced as the hidden chronicler. It was the hidden chronicler that enabled me to tie the other voices together and saved my experiment in writing. I'll read to you from that voice. Alive in everyone is the voice of narrative memory. Call it the hidden chronicler of one's life. I am hers. Because I observe her as she moves through time, I have been called upon by her hands to help them recount her early memories. But I am aware of my limitations when asked to go back so far. For I have not existed as long as she, and I came into being slowly. I would not attempt to recapture these memories without the collaboration of her hands. Day after day, her friend Jean-Paul sits in the red leather chair that was her father's, in order to witness her meditation. But how different are my powers of observation! I monitor her thoughts, her feelings, and the translation of gesture into words. I relive the forgotten moments her hands call up from her body that is also mine. I am present with Jean-Paul and her in this garret, yet unbound to this place and time. I use everything I can to assemble the stories of her life, long-held knowledge and recovered memory, inference based on years of therapy, information offered up to me from her trances, the gestures of her hands. At the end of Speak Hands, I describe a turning point when my hands mimed my symbolic breaking of the picture window behind my mother's couch. It was this window that kept me indoors with my mother when I longed to be outside in the world at large. Writing this book marked the end of my need to chronicle my own internal life and the beginning of my addressing issues in the wide world. Like many of you, I was very active in the peace movement during the early years of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I became increasingly aware of how our fear of death was being manipulated by those with political power to support these so-called wars on terrorism. I jotted down observations as they came to me, feeling they would lead me to write something new. But how could I combat age-old fears and superstitions about death from my own vantage point? I have no credentials for such authority. Where could I stand? I realized that after many months, that only a characterization of death herself, the world witnessed from her vantage point, would have the authority needed, a novel perspective. The Letter from Death is a book I won't read from. I'd rather have you read it to yourself and imagine her voice, now angry at how she's been misrepresented, and now revealing her true self, filled with compassion for humankind. Pamela will show you some of the powerful, often satirical illustrations which are by our son Dave. These are in pen and ink and mixed media. It was a challenge for us to collaborate with Dave living in London and with just one visit home to pull the book together. But I don't think either of us would trade that experience for anything in the world. The fact that one of my greatest heroes of the peace, civil rights, and social justice movements, the late Howard Zinn, wrote the introduction to the Letter of Death still makes my heart stop. Hope was the book I introduced 6 years ago, quite convinced it would be my last. The questions of what hope is and whether it really exists are questions more of us ask ourselves in recent years. I found that I could only come up with affirmative answers if I made them nuanced. The ancient Greeks expressed the conundrum of hope in the multiple and contradictory myths of a fateful gift from the gods to the first humans. The gift was contained in a storage jar or urn. In the Pandora myth, it was translated as box centuries later. I turned to the essential classical myth and let my own allegorical extension of it reach into the present. But where to stand to tell this story? As I felt my way through it, I decided the narrator should not be a personification of hope, but the daughter of hope. The suspense arises from who could the daughter of hope be? What quality would she embody? And who is her father? You need to read the whole book to answer the first question. The first chapter is titled Hope Forlorn. I'll read just a few lines to give you the flavor. Hope Forlorn. Now that I've grown in understanding, I will tell you my mother's story. Hers was the longest solitary confinement in the history of the world. Held without charge, without recourse to any system of justice, still she could not die. Forlorn. How could she have been otherwise? Yet I cannot say my mother was without hope, for she is hope. She does not know whose hand pried off the lid, the roof of her prison, only to shut it before she could escape. After Hope, I spent a few years creating an artist book called 9 Faces. It's comprised of my oil sketches inspired by the work of photojournalists who made, to whom the Slender Book is dedicated. Without such photographers, we would be blind to so much of the world. This book, too, had to begin with the question, what is my vantage point? The answer was in no single place, but in the most remote, diverse locations. Wherever my search through the files of photojournalists made me stop stark still, because a facial expression conveyed a universal emotion that spoke intently to me. I let my hands try to capture the expression and portray the empathy I felt, using only enough words to give the context. When I completed this project, I was longing to write again. But I've never been able to write for the sake of writing. I've always had to be moved and energized by an idea. When I was looking through old writing files, I came upon a piece that I had started but left unfinished because I was too caught up in the ongoing project of the moment. This unfinished text, which I had written in 2009, was called If You Exist. Where was I standing in 2009 to write this? Right where I was actually situated, simply speaking for myself. But Unlike my first 3 books, in which I looked backward in an effort to understand my past, I positioned myself facing the future, trying to face my concerns for the future of the world. Whom should I be addressing, though? Where should the person I was directly writing to be standing? Nowhere in the present, I decided, but generations in the future. I'll read to you the text I found and then subsequently picked up again after an 11-year gap. If You Exist, 2009. I write this out of a kind of nervousness, not really to be heard by anyone living now. There is such a din of voices, such disguised panic in the present. And so I write to you who may not even exist, to human progeny, mine or anyone's, unknown generations hence. If you exist, I think it will mean that what I call the gatherers have prevailed. Right now, that seems unlikely. There is so much worth salvaging. We have come so far, yet at the same time, we seem to be devolving toward our own annihilation, wrecking the world around us in a final tantrum. No one, with her eyes open, can believe any longer in the inevitability of human progress. It seems to me that what we've called modern humanity has been for so long engaged in a contest between 2 impulses. The impulse to gather, to draw close to something, to bring together in a body, and the impulse to hunt, to target for killing, wounding, or capture. I would hesitate to use these words with anyone in the present because the terms are so freighted with old meanings. But if you exist, you may be able to hear them differently, with so much time having passed since their anthropological references. For millennia, hunters and gatherers referred to the synchronous work of early humans to feed their own wandering bands. The hunters provided meat, the gatherers collected whatever nourishment the ground and foliage provided, bountiful or paltry. But I am saying, please, if you exist, clear your mind of those historical definitions. I will use gatherers and hunters as I've redefined them for myself, idiosyncratically, hoping they will speak to you. If you exist, some one of you may be interested to know how the contest looked to one person now. About the only thing I still believe in is that everything deserves to be understood, including everything human. To you, it may seem obtuse to stress that everything any person has ever done is human. But there have always been many who would like to circumscribe the word human in order to leave other people out. If humanity still exists, it may mean you have gotten past such disdain for the other. I want to say it will mean that you have gotten past this, for it is my unapologetic hope. what I see as the impulse to gather is inclusive, the impulse to hunt exclusive. The impulse to gather can be described with a gesture, a sweep of the hand that attempts to collect all those who have been left out. The impulse to hunt takes aim instead. To separate, conquer, or eradicate whatever may be defined by some group as less than human. With the future of the planet now so much in doubt, I think it is a rare person who does not, at least unconsciously, align hopes for the survival of the world with either gathering or hunting. The next chapter is titled After a Gap and picks up again in 2020, the year none of us will ever forget. I'll read a short excerpt from a little farther into the book. It's addressed, of course, to someone deep in the future. This chapter is called What Does It Mean? I'll end with a portion of that chapter. What does it mean? What does it mean to be human? This is the question we've asked ourselves through the ages. Have you stopped asking it altogether? I will say that it saddens me that all progress we have made toward intricate answers, all the clarity we've gained through social sciences, biology, psychology, history, literature, and the passing of time itself, is under threat even now by those who would shrug off the question as no longer useful. What it means to be human is quite a different question from what is human nature, for which we finally realize there can be no answer, except to include what any human in any culture has done or felt. For me, the question of what it means to be human is more pressing than ever, though my own answers reside in recollected incidents, not in academic definitions. Here's such an incident. My young friend, Olivia, was only 2 years old, and I was holding the handle of her stroller while we waited for her mother to pick up food from a Mexican restaurant. We were looking into the window at the array of succulent plants. Something caught Olivia's eye. She pointed her index finger so insistently that it nearly bent back at the tip. Right in front of us was a large, shriveled lobe on one of the plants. She whirled her head around and looked plaintively into my eyes. "Ouch!" she said. Her empathy for the apparent suffering of the plant struck my heart, and I leaned down to kiss the top of her head. Not a definition of what it means to be human, for some humans seem not to possess such empathy. This is only a glimpse at a quality I hold dear in humanity. For that matter, many animals besides ourselves feel empathy, something we've taken far too long to admit. I ask you, who may not even exist, do your children, your little ones, still imagine they know how other species feel? Do you still have little ones at all? Do you grow by sexual reproduction? Does it still take a long time for human progeny to mature? May I, in fact, call you our progeny? Are we anything like each other? I hope you'll read if you exist, in search of a reader deep in the future. Thank you so much for being with me this afternoon and celebrating my belated birthday with a belated book launch. Now I think it's time for all of you to get up and stretch. I'm very much a one-to-one person, so I will be happy to answer any questions or comments that you have while we're mingling and I'm signing books. But now it's time to stretch your legs.